And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN. I'm Tian Wei. Let's begin our show in Washington, where Chinese and U.S. officials inked the historic Phase 1 trade deal, tangible progress in their damaging trade war. China said the deal includes clauses to protect intellectual property and purchase American agricultural products, while the U.S. said that certain technology and cybersecurity issues will be resolved later in the next phase of any deal. Still, this thaw between the world's two largest economies also has businesses around the world breathing a sigh of relief. Take a look.
The United States and China finally signed a long-awaited Phase 1 trade deal at the White House on Wednesday night, which was Thursday morning Beijing time. This caps a bruising battle that has lasted nearly 2 years. The signing signals a warming in economic and trade tensions between the world's two largest economies.
There were arguments, but we respect and cooperate with each other as well. We both have clear goals to eventually reach an agreement on the basis of the interests of the two nations' peoples. I think this is the result of a rational negotiation, and this rationality deserves to be promoted.
The trade truce came 22 months after tensions first flared between the countries in March 2018. A few rounds of threatening words turned to concrete action that July, when the Trump administration imposed 25% tariffs on more than 800 Chinese products. China immediately implemented retaliatory tariffs on its own list of American goods. The stakes were quickly raised. Over the next year, a second and third round of U.S. tariffs were met by China's proportionate retaliation. On June 29, 2019, Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Trump met at the G20 summit, which eased tensions. Yet even after that, the trade war dragged on until December 13th, when Beijing and Washington announced that they'd reached this Phase 1 deal.
Our relationship is great, both on trade and even in military cooperation. This will lead to so many other things. So we have a great, really well-knit relationship, but the best it's ever been.
The Phase 1 trade deal may be a milestone moment along the path to many future dialogues. Yet one reality remains clear. The economies of China and the U.S. are better off competing in peaceful coexistence rather than with open hostility. As a result, the ongoing uncertainty that has dampened the mood for global business suddenly sees the light of optimism, for now at least.
For more on the China-U.S. Phase 1 agreement, we are joined from Philadelphia by Geoffrey Garrett, who's the Dean of the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. From Shanghai, we have Shending Li, professor at the Institute of International Studies, Fudan University. In Beijing studio, Da Wei, director of the Institute of American Studies from China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. And last but not least, Alan Beebe, president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in China. Gentlemen, I want to welcome all of you. Shall I say congratulations? I don't know whether that's the right word to say. And if I could, may I speak by asking Alan, because you are representing the American business community. So, Phase 1 deal, applaudable?
Definitely applaudable. Our 900 member companies, I would say generally speaking, see Phase 1 deal as a sigh of relief. Kind of puts a floor in the in the economic and commercial relationships, and really gets us back to a positive footing. So we're going to be focusing on Phase 1 implementation, celebrating the successes, and monitoring how that goes.
One of the things people ask about Phase 1 is, what is the most important part of it? After all, pages after pages of documents. Professor Da, I'm sure many right now, as we speak, are going through the pages from both countries, trying to see what does that really mean to their businesses. To you, which part is the most important?
I think for me, the most important part is not one of the chapter or one of the part of the agreement, but the signal that this agreement sent out. I think it's a break on the deteriorating China-U.S. relations, and it's a break of the China-U.S. trade war. I think this is very important. After 2 years of this kind of so-called trade war, we really need this kind of, sign of relief to give the confidence to everyone.
To breathe some air
Yes.
after being below the water for quite some time, as they say. The Phase 1 agreement is cause for optimism, believe that many, in the long run trade war between the world's two largest economies. So what's been achieved by both sides so far? Take a look at these. For starters, China agrees to import an additional 200 billion of U.S. products over the next 2 years. From U.S. side, the Trump administration halves the 15% tariff on 120 billion worth of Chinese goods. The two sides also agree on intellectual property protection, technology transfer, and will jointly establish the new dispute mechanisms to resolve their differences. Now, this message, I'm sure, has been repeated once and again today in many news media organizations' reports, but what's going to be its significance? I want to have you, Professor Garrett, to come in. I talked to you, Professor Garrett, throughout the trade war of the last 2 years, so many times. And now, Professor, do you think you can also have a fresh air breathe in a way after below the water, feeling the pressure for so long, Professor?
Yeah, look, I agree with everyone who's spoken already. I think we should applaud this agreement. I think it is a reversal of a deterioration in the relationship. But of course, we shouldn't be naive. There are still a lot of really big and potentially intractable issues between the United States and China, where there are just very different worldviews. But I think today is a day for celebration. I've always been confident that there was going to be a deal like this one. It was only a question of when. And I do think that the American political agenda actually has played a large role. I mean, it's clear that Donald Trump wants to claim a big victory, a big victory that no previous American president could have won.
I see.
But at the same time, I noticed that he's talking about win-win, which I think is very important too, because it's not about the U.S. beating China, it's about the U.S. and China coming together.
That phrase, win-win, is an interesting one. Professor Shen, you've been talking about win-win for many years. That's a phrase Chinese have been using a lot, and it's interesting to see the U.S. president today pick that up. Professor Shen, is that something you are reading the sign of?
Yes. Win-win, the first win is to balance the numbers, the numerics. China would buy more from US, therefore the simple imbalance in terms of the numeral would be better balanced. This is one win. The other win is winning the mood, the spirit of cooperation, mutual respect and mutual cooperation. Through Xi Jinping's formula that settles the complicated dispute through phased program. And now President Trump has picked up my president's formula. So we won. And Trump did not lose because he get more products, the manufactured stuff, financial service, as well as energy, agricultural, food products to be sold to China. So this is truly a win-win, doubly applaudable.
Well, today I can see we're full of shall I say, happy spirits here in the discussion. However, one thing is very interesting. If you take a look at the remarks made by Mr. Liu He, who's the chief negotiator, and also the vice premier, the one who signed the Phase 1 deal with President Trump, he said, once again, repeating Chinese President Xi's word, Mr. Bibi, that there's 1,000 reasons why the two relations should be good, and there's no one reason why the relations should not be good. However, having said that, it does indicate certain kinds of differences in terms of what the U.S. is pursuing and what China is pursuing here in the Phase 1 deal. China is mainly, through this phrase, looking at the wholesome of this bilateral relations rather than buying something, selling something. Well, the U.S. seemed to me, Mr. Beebe, is very specific as to what it wants. It's more a give and take relationship between China and the United States from Washington's perspective. Now, I could be wrong, but Mr. Beebe, what is your take about that? And under what circumstances do you think this one will bring us to next?
Yeah, so, well, it's a complex question, but I think fundamentally, I think both sides, have come to sort of a recognition that, the Chinese system, whether it be the political or economic system and the U.S. Political and economic system, are unique and they are different. But that doesn't mean that the two countries can't cooperate together. But getting to that point, has been a process. At the same time, I think that to go back to the win-win point that you've made, it's really sort of a win-win-win in the sense that many of the elements of the Phase 1 deal also benefit China, as well as benefit the U.S., as well as benefit the world. They benefit Chinese consumers and so on, in terms of having access to better products and services. Just to cite an example, so I think there's certainly more challenging areas ahead as part of Phase 2. But stepping back to the progress that we've made on Phase 1, I think we should sit back, applaud that, and then really focus on ensuring that that's successful from an implementation point of view.
Professor Dai, I want you to wait a little bit before I want to have Professor Garrett also to speak his mind. Professor Garrett, what about that, the wholesome of the relationship, would that be the specifics?
Yeah, I think Donald Trump's typical mindset is a more transactional, tactical one. So I think it was very important for him that there were these numerical targets and goals in Phase 1. In general, I think China tends to take a longer term, more strategic, more holistic view of the relationship. But while we're celebrating today, I think it is important to remember that at the core, I think on both sides there are charges of unfairness. There's a view in the United States that the involvement of the Chinese government in the economy is just unfair, and then I think the Chinese response to that is to say, well, actually no, why should we have to look like the United States? It's unfair of America to demand that we look like them. So there are fundamental philosophical differences, historical differences in the political systems between the two countries. But I think it is, this was a pragmatic deal. Both sides needed the deal. Maybe the U.S. Trump needed it more politically. On the Chinese side, it was more economic. But, I think we were likely to get to this point. It just doesn't mean that all differences between the two countries have been resolved.
If things, Professor Da, that's signed in the Phase 1 are benchmarks that the two sides need to achieve, it could be possible and it should be done. However, when it comes to the holistic relationship, it is very hard to benchmark them and put them into specific parts. So what about that? From Phase 1 about trade to how about Phase 1 trust between China and the United States?
This is a very good question, I think. Yeah, I think Phase 1 trust, this is a very good term.
Two T's, right?
Yes.
Phase 1 trade, Phase 1 trust.
Yeah, that's really wonderful word, I think, because yes, we two countries lack the trust, and particularly here, at least in China, many people view this administration in Washington is not a partner that you can negotiate, you can work with, and maybe someone in DC have the similar view towards China. But I think after almost 3 years after Trump administration came into power, finally the two sides reached an agreement. Probably this is the first agreement the two sides reached since 2017.
Yes,
so that shows the two countries very different from their political and economic system. The two governments maybe they don't like each other, or maybe they don't like each other. They can work together. They can sit down. They can reach an agreement. They can strike a deal. I think this is very important to build the trust between the two countries.
Professor Shen, how long is the distance from this phase one deal between China and the United States as a sporadic case of the relationship, particularly of the current stage, to a case study of how the relationship should be done in the future?
Well, the making of phase one indicates that the two countries have the capability to iron out the difference and to achieve the possibility of success. They are not impossible to do the take and give diplomacy. As long as they would continue to use such a spirit that they have the capability, they are able to make a compromise. I think it's not impossible that they cannot initiate phase two or phase N at a future time to refine their economic and political and overarching relationship. And they have never lacked certain kind of trust. U.S. trust China is pragmatic. China cares it's the people's welfare. And we trust the U.S. cares its own people's welfare and also its leadership's political viability. So they do have a certain level of trust, and this time they have succeeded in betting that the other side will be able to make a win-win outcome with my own side.
I see.
I think in the future they will continue to demonstrate such a capability.
Okay.
And I think I want to also add something to specific perspective versus holistic approach. I think probably I will agree with you that it seems that China tends to take a holistic view, holistic approach in this agreement. But if we change the perspective a little bit, actually those items that China agreed to do, it's not only a request from the Trump administration. Actually, it's also on the agenda of China's reform and opening up. So we can say, actually, through this agreement, Chinese government has decided to take very concrete, very specific steps to further accelerate its reform and opening up, like protecting the IPR, like open Chinese market for finance, for insurance. I think this is very specific. So it's not a specific, at least it's not only the specific demands from the U.S., it's also specific steps that China decided to take in the reform.
And Mr. Bibi, this is exactly the point. I'm sure you're already waiting to jump in on the specific points because your members are very eager to talk about this. Tell me more about the specific points, particularly financial areas, agriculture, in terms of currency as well, technology transfer, intellectual property protection, a lot of areas, so many pages. So tell me more about the specifics.
Sure. Well, I think first off is that anybody who actually reads the phase one trade deal, if you're a business executive, it'll be a very familiar language and feel. There are timelines, there are quantification of targets, and the dispute mechanism has quarterly reviews, half-year reviews, even monthly meetings for the two officials to get together to meet and resolve differences. So I think first off, it really sets the tone in terms of specifics. Whether it's around intellectual property, technology transfer. I think there's some very specific actions that are included in the deal that should give business executives and companies some assurances. Just to cite an example in terms of IP protection, where the burden of proof on violation of IP doesn't rest only with that company or individual that's making the accusation, but also on the party that is alleged to have violated IP. Right. In other areas such as financial services, there's very clear timelines. April 1st, not April 2nd. and also, of course, in terms of purchases, the quantification of that $200 billion being broken down into 4 areas, by year, and even broken down further, not by specific number targets, but the categories of what's included in service, what's included in agriculture. So I think the specificity is there to provide people comfort. Now it's really down to implementation. And I couldn't emphasize more the importance of implementation, because if that doesn't occur, of course there'll be problems, but they need to be worked out. Phase 2 will never happen.
Right. Well, talking about whether phase 2 will happen or not only depends on whether implementation is done by both satisfactions, but also depends on many other factors, as you may know, particularly political factor in your country. Having said that, though, Professor Garrett, go to you about that. Implementation and the mechanism to monitor the implementation, will that set a precedence as to how the 2 administrations will be able to work together? And what if there were conflicts in terms of what exactly is the result of implementation? Those are very detailed questions, but those also point to the core of the real issue of implementation.
Yeah, I think it is good that we're focusing on implementation. I think it's ironic, given that America criticizes the Chinese economy for too much government involvement, that there are these very precise numerical targets for increased imports by China of American products. Those decisions you would expect are taken in the marketplace, and having very precise numbers on how many soybeans or Boeing planes are being sold. That should be subject to market forces. So I think the implementation side, there's possibilities for disagreements because specific targets aren't met. But I think the more important point would be a commitment on both sides to resolve differences. We use these targets as focal points for discussion rather than precise things, yay or nay, whether you've satisfied the agreement. The one thing we haven't talked at all about thus far is the whole area of advanced technology that obviously is in a phase 2 or a phase 3. And when I think about what's actually difficult in US-China going forward, I think it is advanced technology precisely because it's both commercially important and potentially has national security implications. So whatever we've gained in this deal, I'm not so sanguine that it will help us with the really tricky stuff. And I think that, as I said, I think the trickiest stuff is advanced technology, because it has both commercial and potentially national security implications. Having said all of that, though, the spirit of this deal, the fact that the 2 sides want to get together, want to talk more frequently, I think is the most important thing, because it's about resolving differences. It's not about escalating them.
About that point you just made, that even in this phase 1 trade deal, there's specific target of purchasing. And that is coming from the U.S. side. In a way, it is very much government involvement in the business world. I just want to have Mr. Beebe to respond to that a bit about the comments made by Professor Garrett. Mr.
Sure.
Beebe.
Well, I think there's 2 points I'd like to make. One is regarding those purchase figures and the $200 billion being broken down. In the trade deal, it does specify that those should be based on market prices and commercial conditions. So I think it's too early to say how those will actually be achieved, but one would assume that if it's going to be on a commercial basis and on market prices, the underlying principle is that the trading would occur based on market demand. So it's going to be a question, I think, also in terms of the non-tariff barriers that have been discussed as part of the agreement, to what extent and at what pace those are removed in order to really let markets operate. The other point on technology, I would completely agree that a lot of the hard topics around technology will will hopefully be included in a phase 2. There was one element of the phase 1 deal that did include technology, however, and that was under the services category for cloud computing services as an area of
I will go back and carefully read that part.
Yeah, and so the question will that sort of that's on our minds is if those services are going to be provided as part of this phase 1 deal, how will companies and organizations deal with the cybersecurity law, which of course is closely interlinked with cloud computing services that would be provided, I guess, offshore.
Cybersecurity law you talk about here or
China's
in the U.S.?
cybersecurity law, right? So.
And you have also certain regulations in the U.S. or new regulations, it seems.
Yes. So at any rate, with the purchase agreement figures that for services that does include cloud computing, to what extent will that happen and how will that happen?
I have to come back to Professor Gary because he is about to leave. So let me ask you about that part. Since Mr. Beebe raised an interesting case study about the cloud computing. So will that be a starting point for people to think further about where to go in phase 2 and what could be done in phase 2 with the experiences of phase 1?
Well, I would certainly hope so, because I do think collaboration rather than decoupling when it comes to advanced technology is critically important, not only for the two countries but for the world. But it's a very interesting question. If you look at the last 6 months or so, obviously the two cases that we've seen where the US has been very concerned have been advanced facial recognition technologies coming out of China and thinking about the implications of that for the ability of governments to have surveillance activities against citizens. And then the other one is Huawei and the whole world of 5G. So cloud computing is very, very important. I can see that there would be potentially national security implications there, but they're probably not as obvious as in the two other cases I mentioned. So I hope the precedent with cloud computing is a very good one, because I do think resolving differences rather than decoupling technology is the way to go. But again, I think the negotiators here were very pragmatic. The very difficult issues are the ones that they pushed off into the future. It was important that they could get a deal done today, and it's great that they included some advanced technology in that.
With that note, I want to thank you, Professor Geoffrey Garrick, for joining us for this round of discussion. Thank you so much. And the other three gentlemen, please stay with us. And as we are going to the next stage of our discussion, stay with us, because after the break, we will hear more insights from our American and Chinese analysis about China-U.S. Phase 1 trade deal.
In this episode of Travelogue, Megan and I are on the hunt for great hotel designs. From a cyberpunk supercity to manicured gardens and an ethnic minority village, we'll explore accommodation with an architectural theme that embraces the local identity.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back. Global markets have reacted to the Phase 1 trade deal between the world's two largest economies. Let's see who's benefiting from it. Take a look.
Key world stock market indices climbed to new records on Wednesday on hopes the China-U.S. trade deal would reduce economic tensions. On Wall Street, both the Dow Jones Industrial Average and S&P 500 finished at all-time highs, while the Nasdaq ended barely positive. Meanwhile, U.S. farmers seemed positive about the deal. The Illinois Farm Bureau called this a historic day, as U.S. soybean exports to China have suffered huge losses due to the trade war. But soybean farmers in Brazil don't share such optimism. They worry the country is going to lose some of the soybean market it's gained during the trade conflicts. Some local observers say Brazil may lose in the short term, but the Phase 1 deal is overall good for the international trade order. The European markets have shown caution in response to the agreement. In London, experts say anything that stabilizes the global market is welcomed, as the UK will seek new trading opportunities in its post-Brexit era. Others say a main benefit of the deal is that tensions between China and the United States are unlikely to worsen in the coming months, so traders could focus on other aspects of the global economy.
Continue our discussion on the China-U.S. Phase 1 agreement. We are joined new from Seattle by Nathan Mahboubi, who is a research scholar in the Center for Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. Of course, we're still joined by Mr. Shending Li, Mr. Da Wei, and Mr. Alan Beebe. Both of the latter two are sitting in our studio. Go to you first, Mr. Mahboubi, since you're joining us new. What about the technology side? Hi. Congratulations, I guess, for all the China watchers, because you've been busy for the past 2 years, and now finally there is a pause.
It's been good for business.
Good for business too. But Professor, let me ask you about that. What about the technology part of the discussion? Will this really pave a foundation for the discussion about technology, or actually those things are very different in nature?
Yeah, I caught a little bit of the discussion in the previous segment about technology, and I agree that it's an area that is not fully, even really very much covered by this Phase 1 deal, and it will continue to be a source of great tension in the relationship going forward. I think the most that we could hope for out of what happened in this deal with implications for technology is that now there's a mechanism for dialogue between the two countries, not so unlike the strategic and economic dialogue that existed under the previous U.S. administration, which may be a forum to discuss increasing confrontational stances in the area of technology. But there's very little, maybe the cloud computing point that was made earlier is a marginal point, but otherwise there's very little in this deal that really goes to the nature of the technological competition.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Beebe, to you, I want to be even more specific. I mean, if you look at AmCham China now, your board, many of the new members coming into the board are coming from high-tech companies. And they are not, like the middle-level officials in their companies, but rather the top tier and those who have a global impact in their multinational companies. What does this say about China-U.S. in a way, in terms of discussions about technology in the future?
Yeah, so, well, I think it's certainly clear that the importance of technology in the business world is, of course, it's important to technology companies, but it's important to everyone. Any company, large or small, is adopting digital technologies. And for them to compete, whether it be in China or globally, there needs to be the right sort of set of rules, and also the transaction costs in order to be able to adopt those technologies. So I would agree with the earlier remarks that there's a lot of work that remains to be done on the technology front, whether it be part of Phase 2 or otherwise. But coming back to Phase 1, I think one of the big benefits of Phase 1, and assuming again that implementation overall goes smoothly, is trust. Because trust is so fundamental for these more difficult questions around technology. And so this is an area that we're focused on very closely, and we do advocate and really pushing for more opening in the technology markets here in China.
Professor Da, realistically speaking, I mean, Americans are pragmatic people, Chinese are too. Realistically speaking, can trust really be established just with a Phase 1? Even if, atmosphere in Washington about China is already a strategic competitor, to say the least, if not a strategic rival. And when you have white papers putting out about national strategies already showing that China is a rival, according to the words at least, will a phase one really going to save much from that kinds of perceptions?
Of course not. Of course not. I think as our today's discussion, in the early discussion, we have said nobody is naive to believe that we can stabilize the bilateral relations just by this phase one. We have so many problems. Even with this phase one, everyone I think still look at implementation and on trade and economic issue, we have phase two, phase three, so many issues. But beyond the economic side, I think we have so many strategic things. We have security concerns. We have Taiwan issue. We have Hong Kong. We have Xinjiang. We have human rights. And we have, as you said, the Trump administration, pointed China as a strategic competitor. So this is a long-term great power or major power competition. This will last maybe for a very long time, and we cannot avoid it. I think the main task now is to control this competition. While this phase
to
one,
manage.
To manage this competition. While this phase one agreement is a very good starting point to show that we can have a benign or limited competition. I think that's the key of this phase one agreement.
But on the other hand, Professor Shen, the fate of many tech companies are hanging in the air. As we know that Huawei is one of those examples. There are many other examples. Chinese side, the American side as well. American tech companies are exporting components and products to China. It's an important of the global supply chain, but that's not, of course, included in phase one. So, and both economies are also doing its structural reform, meaning they want to upgrade their economy, meaning there will be more in the tech sector and service sector using technologies. So this will become a paramount issue between the two countries. How much will phase one help us with phase two, if that is the issue to be dealt with in phase two, Professor?
Well, phase one shows that we are able to start the process of building trust. We are not idiot. We are not a fool. We are not someone who are crazy. We are smart. We want to protect our economy and through a win-win process. But as David has mentioned, the phase one is not pure enough. We need to have follow-up phases. For example, Huawei is not trusted by America. And probably Chinese side also have its own suspicion over some U.S. IT platforms. But as I do arms control, we often have a saying, no verification, no trust. How to build phase two, we need verification, monitoring, if not surveillance. But how to do smart kind of a monitoring to take care of the sovereign nature of a certain sovereign country. You cannot do too penetrating, deep inside kind of verification, but without verification, no trust. So Huawei and American business need to work out together. How to prove an IT platform has a backdoor or not. Without the technology to prove it or not, we cannot build a proper trust. So Huawei and American IT counterparts should work together to make themselves mutually trustful through transcending the current technology and building a more trustful technology. This gives us the direction how to build a phase two, phase three.
Mr. Beebe, quick response.
Well, I would just agree with that. Regardless of how complex technology is, which of course it is, we have to work on how to solve this. And it does begin with trust. I think the importance of technology, of the understanding of technology, that technology can be a force for good. Because I think there's fundamentally a sort of a sense of suspicion, right? But if we can sort of convert that into the role that technology play to be good for, whether it be for U.S. society or Chinese society or the global world.
Mr. Garrett, Mr. Mahboubi.
Yeah, I'm relatively pessimistic that we're going to be able to solve some of these issues in technological competition in the near future. I've just been in Seattle for the last couple of days for a big conference on U.S.-China relations, the U.S.-China series, and one of the things that I took away from the meeting was that there seemed to be a general consensus that the trade war has been very damaging to both economies in ways that are, easy to criticize. But there seemed to be a deep sense in the room that these technological issues are not easy to solve, and that there are genuine concerns, certainly on the American side, that are going to basically necessitate some tough positions, whether in terms of enhanced CFIUS review, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., or in terms of export controls in terms of things going towards China. And of course, in China, there's more discussion of digital sovereignty, of reducing reliance on foreign technology. And I don't think, these phases, the next phase, I don't think is really get to these types of issues.
And that is why it's very noticeable that the Chinese President Xi Jinping, in a message delivered to President Trump, has been talking about, after the Phase 1 trade deal is being signed, not to decouple about the two countries, whether it's people-to-people exchange, scientific and educational exchange, as well as many other kinds of interactions between the two countries. But will they be able to be maintained? That is the question. Mr. Mahboubi, I want to have a brief answer from you before I go to the other guests.
Sure, and actually, I'm very glad to have the chance to say something about this, because personally, as an academic that's deeply involved in academic exchanges, I feel very strongly about the importance of people-to-people exchange. That has been an important, substantial ballast in the relationship over the last 40 years. And that's something that I think we all have to be very mindful of, because some of these technological issues, military issues, all the grab bag of those complexities in relationship are going to be difficult and are going to require some degree of confrontation between the two countries. But I think we have to really preserve the people-to-people element as a ballast against those. And I am mindful that there's some danger in that respect on both sides.
All right. Professor Shen, you only have 20 seconds.
We should stress a balance between independence and interdependence. On security issues, probably there will be some move toward decoupling, but on other less sensitive, less political issues, we should stress the integration and interaction.
Professor Da, 20 seconds too.
Yes, I totally agree with them. I think we need some kind of controlled or managed decoupling or managed coupling or interdependence. Yeah, to balance security and interdependence. Yes.
Very complicated, but certainly worth thinking. Mr. Bibi, final words, 20 seconds.
Well, the technology challenge that we've described are not going to go away. I think those are all valid. The question will be, how can both countries maximize the space for business despite those complexities as it relates to the adoption and the use of technology?
I see. Alan Bibi, Da Wei, Shending Li, and Nathan Mahboubi. What a pleasure having all of you gentlemen on our program today.